The COVID-19 pandemic has been as close to a collective experience as the world has seen, yet our individual experiences are as different and unique as we are. As science has worked and succeeded in creating vaccines that allow physical bodies to avoid contracting the coronavirus, social science has struggled mightily to put the events of the last 16 months or so into perspective. How can any existing frameworks for understanding the world be sufficient when the world itself has been inexorably changed? A group of scholars wrote a collection of essays and published them in a forum called Thinking Theoretically in Unsettled Times, COVID-19 and Beyond, which was published in the May edition of the International Studies Review. SIS's Associate Dean for Undergraduate Education, Professor Rose Shinko, contributed an essay called The Global Pandemic Coming to a Body Near You. We recently discussed Rose's essay with her. One of the themes found in Rose's essay is that she believes that most pre-existing theoretical frameworks are unable to meet the moment of COVID-19. For example, the idea of meeting in the middle only makes sense if the categories attempting to meet in the middle are themselves stable and separable. We asked Rose, why do you believe the global moment caused by COVID-19 may prove to be a mold breaker of previous academic frameworks?
It's not so much that I think the moment will be a mold breaker as we have an opportunity to make it a mold breaker. And that's what has really driven my theoretical approach, is that theory is always constructing a path forward. It tells you what to look at, it tells you what not to look at, it removes certain features from our view because it tries to be, particularly the standard theories, the dominant theories in IR. It wants to be parsimonious. I think we do have an opportunity to break the mold, if you will, to do things differently. And doing things differently comes from thinking things differently.
Rose writes about how, quote, our precarity is not evenly distributed, close quote, and she calls for the necessity of compassion, that we must care about refugees crowded into encampments, our elderly living in care facilities, multi-generational households, and places impacted by natural disasters, as a way to understand the complex and sometimes contradictory stories of COVID-19. Aside from the humanizing nature of compassion, which is important, why is it objectively important for people to understand these different experiences over the past 16 months or so?
It's not so much that it is objective, but it for me is about learning to pay attention with greater intentionality at the kind of individual level where all of these precarities are playing out. For instance, people with wealth were able to leave cities and buy properties in remote areas. People in cities with wealth were able to stay at home, have their groceries delivered, and by and large, everybody else assumed the precarity for them. And so, for my mind as a postmodernist theorist, what really struck me is how important it is to pay attention to the lived experiences of a variety of people. That's where I actually think it's an ethical obligation to look at those stories and to realize any attempt to kind of universalize the story of COVID is going to flatten out many of these strands. And the problem is that that flattening out is going to be reflective of one's own, all your bias, all of your kind of long held ideas and beliefs and assumptions come into play. And I'm trying to press against that.
One of the interesting things about this essay was the emotion that clearly undergirded its creation. In fact, a reader could perceive a sense of what could be identified as despair from its author. So we asked Rose, have you personally felt despair over the past 16 months?
What I have found is certainly a sense of despair, because then I realize, in many ways, we are all reliant on one another to survive this. When I first wrote the piece, it was a much darker and bleaker piece. And I was really just railing against all theories. And I was even angry at postmodernism, because I did see postmodernism as kind of a way for me to think in the world, that for me really opened up possibilities to kind of think in different ways and be self-reflective.
As someone who works closely with undergraduate students, we knew that Rose would have some thoughts about moving forward because despair can be immobilizing and it can also lead people to take frantic or even desperate measures. So, our last question for Rose was, what do you believe is a possible remedy for despair in this moment in 2021 that can help us all move forward?
I think first and foremost to be honest with oneself, um, and to really look at how I'm thinking in this moment in time, and how and why I'm interpreting things the way I'm interpreting them, being very honest about what kinds of markers I'm relying on to navigate the way I'm thinking in this moment. And I think to grant grace to one another, when you couple that theoretical perspective with the global pandemic and the crisis around race and justice, and broader issues of social justice in America, economic justice, environmental justice, justice with respect to access to health and education, and all of those facets of American society, that's where you can become a bit overwhelmed. But I think at the end of the day, I do have faith in our ability to think our way through this moment in time if we really give ourselves the chance to think in the fullest extent of what that word critical self-reflection entails.